Hello there, this is All 24 News special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file with me, Karim Zachary, coming to you live from Algiers. In recent days, and without entirely succeeding, Russian troops have tightened their control in Severodonetsk, a strategic city in eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described this advancement as terrifying, calling on the West to provide more arms to the Ukrainian military at a time when Moscow troops continue to pound Ukrainian artillery. Russia has clearly had to heavily modify its initial objectives since the beginning of the operation, though it undoubtedly wishes to maintain control over the regions it has so far captured. Regarding captured territory in southern Ukraine, Russia has announced its intentions to stay forever. To talk more about the developments, I am joined live via Skype by Dr. Robert P., researcher and policy analyst from England. And from Kiev, Ukraine, joining us live, Mr. Ivan Ferstuk, editor at the New Voice of Ukraine. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. A short break, and we commence. A top military official with Russia-backed separatist forces in Ukraine's east claimed Monday the city of Severodonetsk is now isolated and Ukrainian soldiers have no choice but to surrender. Edward Bassarin also claimed the Ukrainian army had intensified attacks on the center of Donetsk city, which is under DPR's control, after Western countries started supplying them with heavy weapons.
Severodonetsk is actually blocked after they blew up the last bridge that connected it with Lysychansk yesterday. Therefore, the Ukrainian military units that are stationed there remain in Severodonetsk forever. They have two options: either follow the example of their colleagues and surrender, or die. They have no other option.
So let me commence with you, Mr. Ivan Ferstuk, since you are in Ukraine. Russia is now in control of much of Severodonetsk, the epicenter of the battle for Ukraine's eastern region, Donbass. Zelensky has said the fight for this strategic city may dictate the outcome of the war in the east of the country. What can you tell us about the situation on the ground?
The battle for Severodonetsk, which been happening for around 3.5 weeks, is one of the biggest battles of the ongoing war. It's extremely important since that's the main direction where Russian army is trying to advance to expand on territories, while the territories it wants to control in Ukraine's east. So far, the big question is how long Ukrainian army is willing, able, and prepared to fight against the Russian advancement. Of course, here in Ukraine, many of us expect Ukrainian army to launch a counter-offensive operation near Severodonetsk as soon as possible. And that is a realistic scenario, since Ukraine has troops stationed to the north of that area and to the east of that area, which would reinforce unit fighting in Severodonetsk. But on the other hand, stopping the Russian advancement needs serious tactical reasoning. As long as Russia is deploying daily more and more reserves to the area, there is pretty not much sense in doing counter-offensive operation right now. And we know that Russia is bringing more artillery there and more tanks. So what Ukrainian army is doing now in Severodonetsk, they're trying to exhaust Russian army and, first of all, Russian infantry. Because as we well know, the fighting conditions and the intensity of combat in Donbass area is really high. So people need to be rotated regularly on a weekly basis because they get extremely exhausted. So that's tactics of Ukrainian army. They try to exhaust those Russian soldiers who fight in Severodonetsk.
But how effective is this strategy to exhaust the Russian army or troops, since 70% of the city has fallen indeed under Russian control? That's on the one hand, and we don't see any heavy artillery being sent to Ukraine yet.
That's a very important and very pertinent question. On artillery, for the past 2 weeks, Ukraine signed several contracts on purchasing modern artillery from various European countries. These are NATO standard long-range artillery systems, which are now being deployed to the Donbass area and which will be decisive for the outcome of the fighting in the Severodonetsk. But of course, logistics and then preparing the troops to operate those weapons takes time, and it takes weeks. It's not a matter of days to prepare a soldier to use, for instance, the Zuzana 2 Slovak artillery machine. It takes weeks.
And don't you think perhaps that this stalling is deliberate? I mean, from the West, since we have seen many countries that have been reluctant on sending weapons, especially long-range missiles to Ukraine, saying perhaps it would fall in the wrong hands. What's your comment about that?
Of course, any military supplies which are made crossing the borders require lots of bureaucracy, lots of diplomacy, and lots of agreements. It's not like selling, potatoes or bananas, where you just sign a contract and deliver the goods. Selling weapons is a complicated political matter which needs usually multilateral agreements between several countries. For instance, if the German weapons, then German has to agree on supplying weapons, and that takes time. And then, of course, all those European governments who are responsible for providing Ukraine with weapons, with military ammunition, they have to deal with their own societies and to explain why they're making these moves. Because, of course, fighting the war is not popular with all the people. Some Europeans would be happy to stop it as soon as possible. So, the German government or Spanish government, they do the supplies. They need to explain own people why they're doing this. So they would be supported in this policy. But so far, the statistics of supplying the weapons is pretty good. So basically, if you take Ukraine's storage of artillery that it had as of February 24th when the war started, now it's been basically doubled. Ukraine now has twice as much artillery than before the war, and that is good because the stalemate that occurs in the Donbass area and in other eastern territories, those could be resolved with artillery and tanks. So artillery and tanks are weapons able to advance the situation in Ukraine's best interest. And we hope that this will be happening. But again, you can't do just straightforward counteroffensive losing your own troops. You got to technically prepare this. This is very important for Ukraine. People are priority.
Understood. Let's include in the conversation here Dr. Robert P. It seems that Ukraine is losing against Russia on the front lines and is now almost solely reliant on weapons from the West to keep Russia at bay. My question is, all the aid the West promised to Ukraine is either stalled or isn't as effective as Ukraine aspires. Why is that, according to you? And are we talking about the war spilling into one of NATO member states because of some miscalculation, perhaps, by either side? And what can you tell us about the last warning of Moscow saying they're preparing an adequate response to Poland due to NATO build-up in the country?
Yeah, I think the situation in Severodonetsk at the moment shows that Russia's reconfigured war strategy of advancing using artillery first indiscriminately to kind of clear a path and then advance is paying some dividends. So Russia is kind of slowly and incrementally taking territory in the Donbass. And Ivan is completely correct. Ukraine does require that artillery, heavier weapons and longer range weapons in order to stall that advance and to be able to fight back effectively. As regards the stalling, or what you might call the slower delivery of Western supplies, I think there are two key points that come in here. And the first one is simply matters of logistics and training. So if we consider the HIMARS, the rocket systems that the United States has promised to Ukraine, its initial commitment is only to send 4 of those rocket systems because it's arguing that time is required to train Ukrainian soldiers to operate them most effectively. And this is something that cannot be done in Ukraine because the United States simply won't send accredited military advisors to Ukraine to train the soldiers in the field because of considerations about escalation. And I think that points up kind of the second problem, or rather the second line that Western countries are walking in their supply of Ukraine, in that they want to supply enough and the correct type of weapons to allow Ukraine to fight back, but they do not want to allow the war to escalate. And you can see this again with the type of weapons that have been supplied. For example, these HIMARS that are being supplied only have a range of about 40 miles. And they were supplied by the United States under the condition that Ukraine not use them to attack targets within Russia. So you've got these constraints that are working to kind of slow down weapons deliveries, or possibly supply weapons that are shorter range. I didn't quite get the point about the declaration to Poland. Can you say that again?
Concerning Poland, of course, Russia said that it was preparing an appropriate or adequate response to the NATO buildup in the country. What kind of response are we talking about here?
A response might be, let's say, a Russian missile strike on, let's say, arms depots, but that would be a substantial escalation of the war. That would be an attack on a NATO country. And I believe that Putin would think very carefully before taking such a step. So the message is deliberately ambiguous. I believe it's a threat.
And don't you think perhaps when the West keeps sending long-range missile system to Ukraine, it might fall in the wrong hands anyway? Because we have had some analysts saying or talking about certain reports that say there are some treasons inside Ukraine, especially by pro-Russian separatists there. So if this technology falls within Russian forces, it means that Russia could use this technology and counterattack.
I mean, that would always be a possibility. We know from the example of, let's say, Afghanistan in the 1980s, where the United States supplied Stinger missiles to Afghan resistance fighters, which then some of them passed on to Al-Qaeda in order to be used in their attacks. And one was actually used to try and shoot down an Israeli airliner in the early 2000s. So that is, of course, always a risk. But I think that when you look at the strategic calculation, the risk of not sending these weapons is greater at the moment because Russia is advancing. And that would give it the possibility to take more territory, or if any negotiations happen.
And speaking of Russian advancement, where do you think Russia is going to stop making these advancements?
I think that they will push on as far as they can, certainly to secure the Donbass as a buffer area. I also believe they'll try and probably advance further to improve their control of the southern coast in terms of blocking Ukrainian exports and so on, to try and enact kind of a stranglehold on the country. I don't believe that there's any serious attack on a NATO country in the offing. Russia's just about able to advance in Ukraine at the moment. So I believe that would be kind of pushing too far at the moment. I don't believe they have the real capability.
And for more on what's happening on the ground, Russian forces have gained more ground in the eastern Ukrainian region of Donbass as the battle has reached the highest degree of tension, as military confrontations continue, with Russia widening its artillery attacks and missile launching tactic, while many Ukrainian troops pull back from the region. Let's follow this report and we get back to discussion.
Day after day, Russia is pounding the Donbas region of Ukraine with relentless artillery and air raids, making slow but steady progress to seize the industrial heartland of its neighbor. With the conflict now in its fourth month, it's a high-stakes campaign that could dictate the course of the entire war.
Today, from 50 up to 100 people may die in the most difficult direction, in the east of our state. They are defending our state and our independence, which everyone in the world is talking about. Everyone says so, but we personally feel it very much.
Ukrainian military planes were seen flying low and smoke billowed in the background as the sounds of artillery rang out in Bakhmut. Luhansk region governor Serhiy Haidai said in a telegram post on Wednesday that some Ukrainian troops were fighting with the Russians, while others had pulled back. Ukrainian emergency personnel continue to evacuate people from towns and villages in the eastern Donbass region, but many are reluctant to leave despite the escalating fighting. The team traveled in a large armored personnel carrier nicknamed the Capsule as they made their way past trenches and heavily armed Ukrainian positions, but not all the people the emergency services came to evacuate agreed to leave.
You know, I'm sick and I don't want to impose myself on other people and go from place to place. I don't want that. I'm scared. It's really scary.
Getting a full picture of the battle in the east has been difficult because airstrikes and artillery barrages have made it extremely dangerous for reporters to move around. Both Ukraine and Moscow-backed rebels fighting in the east also have introduced tight restrictions on reporting from the combat zone.
Let me get back to you, Mr. Ivan Verstyuk. Zelensky described the Donbass battles most brutal, and Europe has seen. He adds that Ukraine's military has enough ammunition and weapons, but needs more long-range weapons. How accurate is this, Mr. Ivan Verstyuk, and what can you tell us about this stallment?
Yes, let me describe what's needed on long-term artillery. So far, Ukraine has enough artillery with fire range of approximately 40 kilometers. That would be enough to clear, as you may calculate, 40 kilometers around Severodonetsk. But Russian troops and Russian reserves are stationed all the way to the east from Severodonetsk. In order to reach those targets, Ukraine needs longer range missiles, which would have fire range of 80 kilometers or more. And those are really, really needed. In terms of the nature of the Donbass war, the most critical part is, of course, shelling of the residential districts by the Russian army. Ukrainian government warned all the people who live in the Donbass to evacuate and provided evacuation possibilities like trains and buses. But many locals, like this woman who said that she is too sick to travel, some locals still stay in the cities like Severodonetsk, like Slavyansk, where you hear the missiles striking and exploding every 15 minutes. This extremely critical humanitarian situation with the possibility to lose thousands of civilians dead because of the fight. Ukrainian army is trying to do own urban warfare where it wouldn't be affecting the lives of the local population, because these are our citizens, and obviously Ukrainian army can't do anything that brings risks to local citizens, while the Russian army doesn't have any mercy for Ukrainian citizens, as we have well seen during this war, whether in the Donbass or in the south. So far, it's really important for Ukraine to explain to its foreign partners for supplying the weapons and munition that there is no other option than taking Donbass back. Donbass can't be ceded to Russia, and if the fighting requires more time and more resources and more weapons, then Ukrainian army is able to do this. The Russian army is also, it's not like an endless, military force. Russian does deploy lots of new units and new tanks and new artillery to the Donbass, but it's his own limitations. It can't take all the army it has out of Russia because you always need army to have in the country just for purpose of domestic destabilization. And then when you have this military training, say in Finland or in Baltics, then Russia has to respond with moving more military units to the north of the country, so they'd be closer to where NATO troops are having their trainings.
Clear.
And we hope that when all this latest deliveries of Western weapons, which would be German Gepards and Leopards, then Slovakian Zuzanas, then American-made Palantir, which is a really good one. It had a lot of experience in the combat since the Vietnam War. When this get to the Donbass, and when Russian army sees the sophisticatedness and the quality of these Western weapons, then it would...
you seem very optimistic, Dr. Ivan Verstuk. I would like to raise this question to Mr. Robert P. concerning Western nations, alliance and union. They have been trying so bad to show their union, but in reality we see there is a lot of division inside. A lot of countries that are hesitant about sending these crucial weapons for Ukraine in order to fight back. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, at the domestic front, we see that the European Union and the United States at the top are actually facing a lot of domestic problems, are complaining about the huge and substantial amount of support, especially financially, to Ukraine, that perhaps could have gone to solve domestic problems. What can you tell us about that, Dr. Robert P.?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that here in the UK, the Ukraine war was the top news item 24 hours a day for the first few weeks after Putin's invasion. But in recent weeks, it's been replaced by massive coverage of what people are calling the cost of living crisis, which relates to inflation and to energy price rises, quite large energy price rises, that are a result of Russia's actions in the war and Western sanctions on Russia. So I do think that the longer the war goes on, the more difficult it's going to be to maintain the level of unity that we've seen across the Western world in regard to this. So domestic considerations will come to build up, especially when the war starts to hit people in their pocketbooks. And that's what I would worry about. There's also kind of a level...
do we have any party here to blame about these, let's say, inflation and economic crisis that the West is living? Because it seems that the sanctions that the West imposed on Russia had actually backfired indeed, don't you think?
Yes, in a word, that is happening at the moment. I think there are a few reasons for that. The first reason, I think, is that up until this point, sanctions have been used as a weapon by Western policymakers against countries that were comparatively smaller and weaker and less economically consequential. So let's say countries in the third world. Now, when sanctions were levied against Iran over the nuclear deal, that represented an escalation. But I'm not sure that Western policymakers kind of fully war-gamed out the impact of these Russian sanctions before they put them on. I think they began initially as a way to kind of do something, to take some action against Russia's invasion, and that Western policymakers are only now kind of beginning to come around to the implications for their own economies and for economies in other parts of the world.
And adding to this crisis between Russia and Ukraine, we have a Taiwan issue that is resurfacing. It's as though the US doesn't have a lot on its plate already.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that for the United States, in terms of its national security strategy, its key focus is China. It is East Asia. This is seen as kind of the area where the US really needs to contend with China, which could be a replacement superpower. So the US is largely focused on this, and I think that accounts for it stepping back a little bit in terms of Russia, as well in terms of simply supplying arms deliveries and so on. It's keeping its powder dry.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. Ivan Verstuk? What can you tell us about what is going on here in the world, especially with the tension with Taiwan? Do you think this is going to drift the attention of the world to focus more on what's happening on Taiwan and the ultimate crisis between China and the US? And maybe Russia is going to be left there alone to do whatever it may in Ukraine?
That's a really important question, since the current United States administration of Joe Biden is paying lots of attention to Taiwan, and they've said that they will be supporting Taiwan militarily if any risks arise. And so this kind of, expands America's military involvement throughout the world, which is might be a problem for Biden in domestic policy, where he might be accused that, come on, Mr. President, you're not paying attention to the problems we're having in our country, and you're paying more attention to what's happening in the world and using our resources to support Taiwan or Ukraine or its NATO alliances. But on the other hand, the current geopolitical situation, with all the complexity, we have food crisis, we have inflation, we have whole set of sanctions against Russia, which kind of undermines the business connections in Europe, and especially energy and financial markets. So many big countries and many big superpowers, they kind of reshuffle and reshape own foreign policy, which is China is trying to show own ambitions for the region, whether this is Taiwan or Southeastern Asia. Then, of course, new alliance arise in Eastern Europe, where Poland and Baltics and Moldova.
Speaking of alliances, Mr. Verstuk, let me share with you this info concerning European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who claimed during the briefing in Kiev with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that the Commission is working day and night on assessment of Ukraine's eligibility as a possible candidate for EU membership. Also, the Ukrainian President emphasized on the necessity of integrating Ukraine into the EU, describing the conflict as just a fast stage in Moscow's plan to divide Europe and weaken it. So, Dr. Robert P., European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen indicated that the Commission should be able to complete its assessment of whether the country should be granted candidate status to join the EU within the coming week. How difficult is it for Ukraine to join the EU? And how is this membership going to affect the Russian advancement anyhow in Ukraine? And don't you think that by having Ukraine join the bloc, the EU is going to pay a heavy economic price rebuilding this country? That's in case the war let up, of course.
I think that Ukraine's application, there are some issues that the European Union will look at in terms of the stability of democratic institutions, in terms of the rule of law and anti-corruption. I think that the EU Commission will probably approve candidate status, but there's a further stage when all the 27 EU countries will need to agree on whether to bring in Ukraine or not. And there may be some roadblocks at that point. We know that about a month ago, Macron argued that Ukraine should not join the EU yet, but it should be part of some kind of parallel EU, although it's not clear what he meant there. And there are some concerns that have been raised by European countries such as Denmark about kind of rule of law issues and so on.
So you're talking about corruption issues in Ukraine?
Yes.
So the corruption issue on the one hand, and on the other hand, we see that other candidates such as Turkey and other countries that have proved to be very effective and have very strong economic background, and still they were refused the membership. Why insisting on Ukraine to join the EU here, and seeing that there is going to be a very difficult economic challenge here?
I think the insistence is partly ideological. It's based on the groundswell of support for Ukraine that's happened all across Europe due to the invasion. So I think the calculation is more of an ideological, a moral, and a political one than it is an economic one. I think the membership would probably also be good for Ukraine. President Zelensky had made noises in the past about possibly giving up Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO as part of any deal with Russia.
Excuse me, Dr. Robert P. I would like to give this final question to Mr. Ivan Vershtuk. Since we run out of time, we have roughly 1 minute and a half left. What about you, Mr. Ivan Vershtuk? Can you tell us what about your comments?
Now, I think the logic of Ukraine's membership in the EU should be, first of all, security. Since if EU accepts Ukraine, it's get the country which has the most experienced troops in Europe. None of European armies has fought a war of this complexity as the Ukrainian army. And now the European Union is shifting its policy to pay attention more to defense and security needs, especially when it comes to Eastern Europe. So having a country in the EU which has so much experience in real combat would be definitely an advantage. And then whether we're talking about economy, of course, right now Ukrainian economy is extremely weak, and it will take decades to reconstruct it and to become the European-style economy, which we admit, and we need help on this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your thorough analysis, dear guest. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. We have reached the end of our program. Bye for now.